Hello and welcome back to session 2 of this LGA webinar looking at the role of local ward councillors in the COVID-19 response. I'm going to start by having a quick look back at what we covered during session 1 before then looking forward to the material that we'll be covering during this second session. You'll recall that during session 1 our focus was really on ensuring that you were aware of the arrangements that would be in place to support the work of officer colleagues in dealing with the COVID-19 response. So we spent some time looking at the theory around the emergency management cycle that professional emergency responders use to manage major emergencies, and then had a look at some of the statutory duties that local authorities have got under the Civil Contingencies Act. We then looked at the way the operational response in which your officer colleagues are involved would be structured before finishing the first session by me taking the opportunity to share some thoughts about how you may manage to maintain the trust and confidence of the communities you represent and lead during the COVID-19 response. And I hope that the process of my sharing those thoughts provided you with some food for thought that was useful. Session 2 is going to be much more clearly focused on the role of elected representatives during the COVID-19 response. We're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at the role of senior councillors, leaders, executive mayors and portfolio holders during the response, and some of the things that they may be turning their attention to, before looking in rather more detail about some of the things that you as local ward councillors may wish to consider during the response phase. Now, this is a pre-recorded webinar that's intended to provide a flavour of the sorts of things that your role might involve in your particular areas. And in many ways, that's intended to set the scene for the series of online interactive workshops that the LGA will be looking to run later on in the year as we move through the COVID-19 response. And indeed, we'll finish session 2 by having a quick look forward to some of those future online workshops. Now, you'll remember this image, I guess, from session 1, which illustrates the structures that will be in place to support the operational response being managed by officers. After I'd talked you through that, I made the point that in parallel with the operational activity being undertaken by officers, there was equally important political work to be done by elected members, whether they are senior councillors who are members of the political executives, cabinets in councils and so on, or local ward councillors, backbench councillors. In either capacity, councillors, in my view, have a critically important political leadership role to exercise alongside the professional leadership being provided by councillors. Thinking from the perspective of senior councillors now, they have an important political leadership role both within the council and also beyond the council. As far as their political leadership role within the council is concerned, there are many things that senior councillors will need to think about and put in place as we move through the COVID-19 response. Probably at the top of their list is the essential requirement to establish clear communication links between senior councillors and senior officers to make absolutely certain that there is good alignment between the operational and political response to COVID-19, to make sure that the work that they are undertaking professionally as officers is complemented by and being complementary to the political work being undertaken by senior councillors. There's also a number of decisions that need to be taken in consultation with officers about the way in which political leadership and governance arrangements will operate during an emergency. And not all of those decisions can be taken in advance of the emergency happening, because they will be dictated to some extent, at least, by the nature and complexity of the crisis. So some of the decisions that members of the political executive will need to take is around who will be the public face of the council in its civic leadership role. Sometimes this is the leader or executive mayor, but depending on the nature of an emergency, they may wish to designate one of their cabinet member colleagues who has a portfolio responsibility relevant to the emergency to fulfil that role. experience of talking to colleagues up and down the country, and probably, as you would expect, the public face of the council is in every local authority that I have any knowledge of being undertaken by the leader or executive mayor. There's also decisions about who's going to provide the political leadership for business as usual. It may be that there's so much political capacity required to provide the necessary civic leadership to the COVID-19 response that a member of the cabinet will look after business as usual whilst the leader or executive mayor fulfills that civic leadership role. There's a decision about who will lead on providing political support to initial recovery activity. You'll remember during session 1 that I made the point, whilst everybody's efforts during response should be primarily focused on mitigating the impact of an emergency, the sooner you start work on recovery, the better. Senior councillors may also make a decision that one of the cabinet will lead on ward councillor engagement, so there is a clear route for political discussions to take place in parallel with all the other sorts of communication that's going to be moving around during a large emergency response of the sort we're dealing with at the moment. There's a third requirement to make absolutely sure that necessary decision-making arrangements are in place. In the circumstances we currently face, business as usual decision-making arrangements may not necessarily be fast enough, and also during a period of lockdown, the inability to physically get people together to make collective decision-making arrangements work may mean that interim arrangements have to be put in place. Now that could be through emergency delegations to officers, or it could be through agreement that a leader and deputy leader, for example, might take decisions that would under normal circumstances be taken by the cabinet collectively. A fourth area about ensuring arrangements are in place to enable core democratic processes to take place, notwithstanding the fact that we are dealing with lockdown at present, which makes face-to-face meetings really difficult. There are some really important democratic processes that have to take place, and thought needs to be given to how they will work in the current circumstances. Confirm arrangements that have been put in place for briefing senior and ward councillors, passing of really good quality information, keeping senior and ward councillors up to date in terms of what's happening with the COVID-19 response is so important, and senior councillors need to confirm that fit for purpose arrangements have been put in place for that purpose. Similarly, it's really important that whilst the emergency response effort is being invested in, that business as usual, certainly essential business as usual, continues, and therefore senior councillors will be in the process of confirming that business continuity plans are being deployed to ensure that that happens. They also, as senior councillors, need to provide support and encouragement to council staff and others involved in the emergency response effort to reflect how very hard they are working and have been working for many weeks now. And finally, senior councillors should be maintaining a record of significant actions and decisions that they're taking, and also events that they've witnessed. As things begin to settle and we move towards a new normal post the COVID-19 response, senior councillors, politicians, are going to be asked to provide information about their involvement, and also they will be expected to be accountable for things that they did during the COVID-19 response. Now, while some of those questions may be asked very soon, equally, it may be that years will pass before senior councillors are asked to provide an account of their involvement in the COVID-19 response, and therefore making sure that you record details of how you've been involved as a senior councillor. Really important thing to think about at present. As well as political leadership within the council, of course, senior councillors have a political leadership responsibility beyond the council. I've already touched on the crucial importance of being seen to provide highly visible civic leadership as the public face of the whole council. People expect their local authorities to step up to the mark when they're dealing with the very difficult circumstances that are being dealt with at the moment. And if councils do that well, they strengthen the bond that they have with communities and provide enormous reassurance that you have got local authorities doing a good job. And that, of course, builds high levels of trust. It's important to consider at least initiating a dialogue with senior councillors in other local authorities. COVID-19 is unique in my experience in that every single local authority in the UK is dealing with this emergency at the same time. Now, on the one hand, that means everybody is very busy, but equally it means there will be valuable learning emerging as different senior councillors deal with the response, and sharing that learning across different local authorities could be really valuable, and therefore senior councillors need to think about how they might achieve that. Similarly, initiating dialogue with local MPs to think about how they will add value during the COVID-19 response. And it may well be necessary on specific issues to engage with government ministers so that they are thinking about the particular implications of different aspects of the COVID-19 situation and the way it's going to impact on individual authorities. If necessary, it may be a requirement for senior councillors to make representations to lobby central government for financial assistance to deal with specific issues that have emerged at a local level. Whilst the default position in emergency planning is that in the short term, at least, local authorities should meet the cost of response through the investment of contingency reserve, it's conceivable that circumstances will arise that generate such a significant financial burden that the government need to step in and help. Clearly not an issue during lockdown, but as the lockdown requirements begin to be loosened, it may well be that senior politicians, VIPs, will want to visit a particular area. And where that is the case, senior councillors have got a really important role in facilitating it, and not just facilitating these sorts of visits, but making sure that they are handled in a way that's sensitive to the mood of the community, which can be very different from one place to another, and also from one time to another. So that's a little about the political leadership role that senior councillors have. Now let's move on to think about the really centrally important role that local ward councillors are having and will continue to have for many months and potentially years as we deal with COVID-19. In shaping some of what I've got to say, I've spent quite a bit of time reading documents, the LGA guide on the role of councillors in civil emergencies, which was produced back in 2008. I've revisited that. I've had a look at some of the learning that came out of significant events such as wide area flooding and the Manchester Arena terrorist attack to see what was relevant from that learning to the role of ward councillors in COVID-19. As you would expect, I've had a good look at the councillor guidance that the LGA released very soon after the COVID-19 situation emerged to see what that says about the role of local ward councillors. And as well as doing all that reading, what's probably been just as important, and I think probably more valuable from my perspective, is that I've hit the phones and the Zoom video conferencing to talk to people around the country, both senior officers, senior councillors and local ward councillors, about the kinds of things that they're dealing with out there in the real world associated with the COVID-19 response. And I have to say that not only has that been instructive, it's actually been incredibly inspiring. There is some fantastic work being done by local government, something of which we should all be very proud, I think. Now, in the way that I'm going to share my thoughts around the role of ward councillors, I'm going to approach it from two dimensions, or on the basis that there are two dimensions of a ward councillor's role. The first is as community leaders. They, from an emergency planning, emergency management point of view, are a focal point in the process of building community resilience. And that's about the ability for businesses and residents to effectively respond to and recover from emergencies and other crises, alongside the statutory agencies, such as local authorities, that will be involved. So the dimension as community leaders. And secondly, as community representatives. Clearly, local ward councillors have got a very important role in influencing the work of the council such that the needs of their local residents and businesses are met in the way that the council does its business. Now, that is important in normal times, and the level of importance in that representative role, I think, has been really amplified by the consequences of COVID-19. So let's start with the community leadership role of local ward councillors. What are some of the things that you may want to be thinking about as you lead some of the aspects of the local response to the coronavirus pandemic? The first thing to say is that you need to continue to be present and visible as that trusted local face of the council. And I've put the words present and visible in inverted commas for pretty obvious reasons, because during lockdown you can't be physically present and visible, but there are ways that you can maintain high presence and visibility. And of course, technology can be really helpful. There's the ability to get information out by email, social media. The whole video conferencing space has become very, very busy, and it's a really useful way of interacting with people, potentially by holding virtual surgeries with people in your particular patches. And as well as new technology or newest technology, there's some traditional ways, so getting information, contact details for yourself out in local newsletters and leaflets, and of course the good old-fashioned telephone, picking the phone up and talking to people. By being present and visible using these various routes, not only does that show that you and the council you represent really care about what's happening in the local community, it also enables you to gather really useful information that can help you in your role. So that whole business about providing reassurance by being visible and present, crucially important. Secondly, you probably already are, but certainly need to become a conduit for the flow of reliable and trusted information, accepting that a ward councillor is the trusted local face of the council. As a messenger, they've got the ability to communicate really important information to people. Now, whether we're talking about local government or central government, there's critically important public health information about support arrangements that are being put in place, various advice that needs to be provided to people that they really need to have communicated. And in addition to the really important information and advice that needs to be communicated to people out in communities, there's a whole lot of unreliable, unhelpful, and in some cases dangerous information floating about. So having the ability to use local councillors as trusted representatives of government to communicate information means that really important information can be got through and landed with businesses and residents. Third aspect to think about in your role as community leaders is about signposting residents and business owners to the support that they need. Many people in the past have gone about their day-to-day business, whether they run a business or are a local resident, without the need to engage to any significant extent with central, local government, the state. Well, that's all changed for many, many people. And for the first time, they are finding themselves in circumstances where they are needing to engage with statutory agencies, both to access long-standing arrangements that they've never needed before, but also to take advantage of some of the support arrangements that have been put in place in response to COVID-19. And for people who are already uncertain, anxious, really concerned in many cases, that can be a confusing, perplexing and bewildering space. And my experience is that local ward councillors, even though they may not realise it, tend to have a really, really good understanding of the way the system fits together. And they can therefore operate almost like human sat-nav systems in directing people who really need help, sometimes urgently need help, in the right direction, and also to steer them away from some of the risks that have emerged that they won't want to get involved in. So that signposting role for local ward councillors, really significant. A fourth area to think about, and it seems straightforward, But this idea of encouraging and thanking officer colleagues and others who are working locally on the local response in your patches really shouldn't be underestimated. A pat on the back, a thank you from a local ward councillor really can go a long way to making people feel that the contribution that they're making is valued. And then the last thing to say about the community leadership role that ward councillors have is about setting time aside to start planning for recovery. Now, whilst I've no doubt at all that alongside all the volunteers and the businesses and people in your communities at the moment, you're really very busy on the response phase, as the restrictions around lockdown become eased and we start the process of the long journey towards recovery, there will be a significant number of risks potentially that emerge as we move into recovery. So people who are doing lots of voluntary work locally now going back to work and therefore not being able to volunteer any longer, for example, there will be risks emerging. Equally, there's some fantastic opportunities, I think, that have come out of the COVID-19 local response, particularly the huge wave of public spiritedness that we've seen. There's real capacity and value in that, and if, as we make the transition from response to recovery, those opportunities are lost, that would be a shame. So starting to think about how you'll work in your communities on the recovery effort will be time well spent at this stage. Moving on to think about the representative role that you've got as local ward councillors. Again, there's a number of things that I think are quite important for you to think about. The first is that you, as somebody who really knows your patch, will be able to identify the needs of residents and businesses and then feed these in to appropriate response organisations via officer colleagues from your local authorities. I mentioned earlier about the really valuable asset that ward councillors can be in communicating important information and advice to communities on behalf of government. Well, that communication link, that relationship, also operates in the opposite direction on the basis that you will be able to feed really good community intelligence about levels of vulnerability, voluntary organisations that have got really good capacity to help with the response and potentially in the future recovery effort. That kind of community intelligence can be invaluable in informing the response that's being provided by statutory agencies. So that's a really important part of your role as community representatives. Second area to think about is that, of course, you need to support and you need to inform your council's operational response, but avoid the temptation of straying into operational decision making. On the left-hand side there, the structures and processes that are in place to support the operational response need to be populated by people who have the professional background, the experience and the training to operate in that environment effectively, not least because it improves the quality of the operational response, but also in the future when analysis is being done of how well the response operation went, officers will need to be held to account and explain the decisions and so on that they took, and they need to be competent now in order to be able to demonstrate that in the future. So it's a complementary role that councillors have in leading the political response to an emergency, but it's distinctly different from the operational role that officers have. Third area to think about is the essential scrutiny and constructive challenge that ward councillors and senior councillors need to be able to introduce. But timing is really important. Of course, once we move out of response and into recovery, councillors have got a crucially important role in leading review processes and undertaking scrutiny to make absolutely certain that lessons are learned, both about things that went well so that good practice can be shared and disseminated, but also where things didn't go as well as they should have done, that those lessons are identified, learnt, and a response to them is put into place. So a really important role for councillors in the future. However, My view is that whilst we are still in the response phase, we need to maintain this "we're all in this together" spirit. I think that provides a level of join up and coherence to the response of local authorities that not only makes their response better, but it's also reassuring to see that kind of join up and collegiate approach from the perspective of your residents and businesses. In the same way as it's relevant for senior councillors, I think it's very useful for local ward councillors to record details of their experience of having been involved in something like the COVID-19 response. Now, I'm certainly not talking about a formal decision log of the sort officers are required to take, so that when they make a decision about something that is going to impact on the operational response, not only do they record that decision in writing, but they also record a clear rationale for why they took that decision. That's a professional discipline that officers need to be on top of. We're not talking about that. What we are talking about, though, is almost a narrative, a story of your experience of having been involved in this unprecedented set of events. Not only will that be useful from your own perspective, I guess, when you reflect on it in the future, but in terms of the role that you have, the contribution that you'll be able to make when we move into reviewing the response to make sure lessons are learned and so on, the really local experience that ward councillors are developing will be incredibly useful to people who are leading those kinds of processes. So maintain a record of what you're experiencing. And then the last thing I'd like to say as I bring the second session to a close, which I think is really important, is don't forget to take care of yourselves. Obviously, as elected representatives, as public servants, as people with a very strong sense of public duty, you're going to be focused really acutely on the health, safety and well-being of others, whether they're business owners or local residents. But please, please make sure that you maintain a degree of balance, because you also have a responsibility to look after your own health, safety and well-being, both because you, like everybody else, is at risk from the COVID-19 virus, and also because this really is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. So making sure that you create time for yourself, as well as looking after your health, is going to be really important to make sure that you can continue to provide the sorts of contribution that you are making. As far as next steps and closing remarks are concerned, the LGA now, having produced this pre-recorded webinar, will be seeking the views of local ward councillors such as yourselves on what the focus of these interactive workshops should be on. What specific aspects of your role would you find it really useful to have a forensic look at, alongside other councillor colleagues who would be able to ask questions, share details of their own experiences as well. So to help with that process, please do take a few minutes after we finish this session to complete the questionnaire that my colleagues at the LGA have produced. And then a final point from me, I guess, as somebody who no longer works for local government, but continues to work with local government, and this touches on something I said earlier, I have genuinely been hugely inspired by the stories that I've heard about the massive contribution that councils up and down the country are making to minimising the impact of this dreadful pandemic. And you are part of that. So whichever local authority you're from, whichever ward you represent, it's a personal thank you from me for the spectacular efforts that you and the rest of local government are making to deal with COVID-19. Thank you, and I look forward, I hope, to speaking to you directly when we start with the programme of interactive workshops. Thank you.